I'm going to show a few images on screen in a second, and I want you to think about how they make you feel. What I've just shown, for those of you who don't know, are what's called liminal spaces. Liminal spaces are an aesthetic that popped up on the internet in recent years, and have since then spawned several subgenres of media that all share some of the same aspects, which I'll get into more later. In short though, liminal spaces are man-made places that lack people, and act as transitional areas between two places, or are sometimes areas that are meant to have people, but are now abandoned. In both cases, these areas end up feeling very off or uncanny. There's commonly a few different feelings associated with these. They can be unsettling, lonely, surreal, or even comforting and nostalgic. And if you're anything like me, you find them oddly fascinating to look at. Something about these keeps me watching for one reason or another, and today I'd like to explore why that is. I know this is more of an art topic, but I find, either intentionally or not, that video games tend to do stuff like this a lot. And I think that makes them almost a perfect fit for this aesthetic, and a great lens for me to talk about liminal spaces as a whole, why they give these specific feelings, and what makes them work so well in the medium of video games specifically. If that interests you, stick around with me as we explore the unsettlingly comforting aesthetic of liminal spaces. So what are liminal spaces? As mentioned earlier, they're typically transitional or abandoned areas, usually with dimly lit, almost dreamlike lighting. Think of a parking lot at night, or a hotel hallway, or an empty mall. These places aren't creepy per se, but they do give off a really uncanny vibe. And since our brains try to make sense of these in-between areas, they just seem off. They're places that are familiar, but without people, they become uncanny, and sometimes even unsettling. However, I think these spaces can also be comfy and nostalgic. This may not be a feeling shared by everyone, but being someone who grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the world was changing rapidly, places like malls and old blockbusters fell out of relevance and became abandoned. So when I see a floor like this, or something like this, I'm reminded of those places. Some of these images invoke a strange comfort and longing for the past. I'm a very nostalgic person, which I made a whole video on if you want to check that out here. And viewed through that context, these images can almost feel like looking at a photo album of your childhood. You don't know this place, but you feel as though you've been here before. But enough about brain-related pseudoscience. I'm primarily a channel about video games, so let's talk about some video games. I think they're the perfect medium for exploring the allure of liminal spaces. Intentionally or not, games have been doing this for years, far before the ideas of these became popular. Games like Silent Hill, or the original Tomb Raider, where the maps just have these unsettlingly empty vibes to them. Part of that could be the fear of the unknown, empty areas with dim lighting that keeps you wondering what could be around the corner, or autophobia, the fear of being alone. However, it doesn't have to be exclusive to horror games. An example I often go back to is Mario 64, specifically the hub world between levels. Peach's castle has a lot of these little connecting hallways and in-between areas that make up the castle, and aside from a few toads that hang out there, it's mostly empty. Something about the painted-on sky and landscape textures on the walls and ceilings gives it a strange, uncanny feel. These long hallways and places that seemingly go nowhere turn what would be an ordinary place into something strange and off-putting. Same thing applies to the single-player trials for Mario Kart. The only other thing on the track is the ghost of your previous runs. It all feels off. You know there should be more racers on this track, but it's just you in this big, empty area. Pretty much any game from this era has this kind of look to them. The hardware limitations force the developers to craft these low polygon areas with jagged, unnatural edges, and geometry that doesn't feel natural. It's something that can't easily be replicated in today's day and age with high graphical rendering. That being said, there's a whole slew of PlayStation 1 style horror out there that has popped up in recent years, and it takes this kind of stuff as inspiration, and some are genuinely good and don't feel out of place when compared to older titles. Another notable example is Minecraft on peaceful mode. Minecraft isn't something I'd consider conventionally unsettling, but sometimes it really do be like that. Aside from the few mobs that populate the environment, it's mostly barren aside from yourself. This was more prevalent in earlier versions of the game, but even now, the ambient noises and the lack of anything in the area can really be off-putting in some situations. Look at any empty multiplayer map. There are many examples of this, but games on the Source engine are particularly notable. Counter-Strike Source, Garry's Mod, Team Fortress 2, all games that without people just feel lonely, and the maps feel like they're lacking something. On the topic of the Source engine though, probably the best example of a liminal space game is found in the Stanley Parable. You play as the titular Stanley. You wander the seemingly abandoned office building that you work at to find that there is in fact nobody else there. aside from the narrator, which you indirectly interact with based on your actions. In terms of aesthetics, the whole game is a liminal space. Long empty hallways and offices with nobody in them. Incomplete areas of the map with pathways to nowhere. It all has a really weird, dreamlike quality. Throughout the game, depending on your actions, the narrator will speak to both Stanley and to the player themselves. This is important because it blurs the boundary between the game and the player. Fourth wall breaks like this often catch people off guard, or make them feel uneasy. The game uses this to play with your expectations and question the nature of the medium of video games themselves. The technical definitions of liminal are as follows: occupying a position at or on both sides of a boundary or threshold, or relating to the transitional or initial stage of process. I think this game is a great example of the former, in its aesthetics, gameplay, and even the themes as a whole. Blurring the line between the player and the game makes for a very memorable experience. I won't spoil any more here because there's a lot to unpack, and because this game is really something that should be experienced rather than described. I can't talk about liminal spaces and video games without at least mentioning the Backrooms. The Backrooms, for those of you who don't know, was originally a 4chan post in 2019 on X, asking users to post disquieting images that just feel off, with one anon replying to it with the now famous image of the Backrooms and this caption. This ended up spawning tons of fan games and other media, such as the very popular video series by Kane Pixels, The Backrooms Found Footage. These are all cool, neat works of art, but they're not for me. I personally think the more stuff like this gets flushed out in terms of lore and such, the less interesting it is. I think the most important part of the allure of liminal spaces to me is the lack of context. The less we understand about it, the better. It's the uncanny feeling we get from our brains trying to make sense of something that doesn't quite feel natural, or that doesn't behave like we think it should. Not all liminal space horror is like that though. One game I think that does intentional liminal space horror well is
Anemoiapolis? Anemoiapolis. I think that's it.
Anemoiapolis is a short indie horror game on Steam where you play as a guy who falls down into this bizarre amusement park that's almost entirely made up of liminal spaces. This was exactly what I was looking for in a game about liminal spaces. It nails the aesthetics so well. Each level is a different theme, all providing different liminal spaces to explore. Sometimes it's a water park you may have seen in a dream. Sometimes it's that mall you visited as a child, now abandoned. Sometimes it's the Windows XP default wallpaper. Each of them are so well done and nail that spooky, lonely, nostalgic vibe so well. Same with the sound design. The ambient hum of the lights, the vaporwave quietly playing through blown out speakers around the park, it all just feels so fitting. The game is marketed as a horror game, and while I'm not sure if it exactly qualifies, it was definitely unsettling at times. However, it was also kind of nostalgic and relaxing. Kind of like walking through an art museum alone and having shit peek out around the corner at you, just often enough to make you uneasy. This place is clearly empty, but you don't exactly feel alone here. The game, as of now, isn't finished, but I'm excited to see a full release. I can't guarantee it's a game that everyone will enjoy, but if you like this kind of thing, I'd say it's definitely worth checking out. I personally just enjoyed roaming the different areas and checking everything out. Something about it's just so addictingly intriguing. Superliminal, if you couldn't guess by the name, is another game that draws heavy inspiration from liminal spaces. It's a puzzle game similar in style to something like Portal. Plot-wise, you go into a dream therapy program where you enter a dream world composed mostly of long looping hallways and large open rooms with very little in them. You solve puzzles using forced perspective and optical illusions to progress from level to level, and you eventually become trapped, and your goal is to escape the dream world, as it becomes increasingly surreal. This game has a lot of really unique mechanics, and the way it plays with your perception of reality is really neat. And honestly, that's all liminal spaces really are. Ordinary things looked at from a different perspective. It's honestly one of the most unique and interesting puzzle games that I've played in recent years, and it's definitely something I can't recommend enough. The whole idea for this video came up because I've been intrigued by these YouTube compilations of liminal spaces, and it seems like people in the comments generally have very divisive feelings about them. Some feel nostalgic and reminisce about wandering their hometowns late at night when the rest of the world's asleep. Or they're reminded of places that look like they're taken straight from their childhood that maybe never even existed. Some talk about the fear of being alone, or the fear of the unknown. That anxiety that anything could be around the corner, and the creeping dread of these in-between spaces that our brains can't quite understand. Some talk about the lonely or cold nature of them. The lack of people and the washed-out lighting can really make for a very sad or empty feeling, akin to the last day of summer vacation, or saying goodbye to someone or somewhere familiar. I think all of these are true to an extent, and that's what makes liminal spaces so interesting. I haven't seen many art forms that can make me, as well as others, feel so many different things at once. And I think video games have the ability to portray this in a near-perfect way. They allow us to explore the boundaries between the familiar and unknown, and open our eyes to a unique perspective of the world around us. Regardless of your feelings toward them, it can't be denied that there's something so alluring about these images, and I can only hope that there's continued interest in them, and that people continue to make media inspired by them, because this shit's just so cool. Man, I really just talked about hallways and empty parking lots for 5 pages worth of time. What has my life become? Hi there, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it and you want to leave a like and maybe subscribe, I'd appreciate that a ton. This was an odd but fun topic for me to write about. I think liminal spaces are just so cool and pleasing to the eyes. How do they make you feel? Is there a specific feeling or a memory that you associate them with? Feel free to comment your thoughts down below. As always, thank you for watching, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.